Our topic today is, how do you trust God when you do not know what to do? How do you trust God when you do not know what to do? Have you been in a place where you simply did not know what to do? When life just smacks you around a little bit, or the floor drops out beneath you, or you run up against a wall unexpectedly and you want to trust God, you know you need to trust God, and yet it's just really tough to do. Have you been there? If you haven't been, you will be, I suspect, because that's what we face. And so the question for us is, how do you trust God when you don't know what to do? We're looking at two stories in Mark's gospel. What Mark does in this part of chapter 5 is something he does occasionally in his book, and that is he begins with a first story, then he interrupts it with a second story, and then returns to the first. Almost a sandwich approach, if you will, to intensify the teaching. So we're going to look at two intersecting lives in this part of the gospel, beginning in verse 21. So let's look at the text together. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. Now, pause there and get this first picture. I want you to sense this story as we look at this text together. Jairus is a ruler of the synagogue. His daughter's dying. He makes his way to Jesus. There's a large crowd around Jesus. Twice the text tells us that there's a crowd pressing up against him. Jairus believes Jesus can do something if he gets to his daughter in time and touches her so that she will get well and live. Jesus agrees to go, and off they go. So that's the first part of story number 1. Then verse 25, here's the interruption, a second story. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had, and she was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Now look at verse 27. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well." Instantly her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. At once, Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. He turned around the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." So this is a good day for this lady. Now we pick up with story number 1 again. Look at verse 35. While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is" what? Tell me. "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. They came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." Now, she had died. His point is to say that this story is not over. There is more to come here. Now, watch what they do in response to that. Verse 40, they laughed at him. Then his response, "But he put them all outside." He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. she was 12 years old. At this, they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, that's the word of the Lord. May he teach us from his word. What do you do? How do you trust God when you do not know what to do? I hope you've got a pen, you've got a pencil, you can type in your phone. I want to give you some steps to take. Here's number one. How do you trust God when you don't know what to do? Number one, we must come to Jesus. We must come to Jesus. Now, again, I want you to enter into the story with me. I introduce you, first of all, to a woman. We don't know a lot about her. We don't know her name. We don't know much about her history. We don't know about her family. What we do know is not good. For over a decade, for 12 years, she has suffered with some kind of blood disease, probably a female problem, probably a menstrual problem. It's quite possible that this disease would have made her infertile, which was a desperate state for a first century woman. Because she was bleeding, she would have been declared unclean in her culture. She couldn't have gathered in this worship center with us because of her uncleanness. And here's what we learn. She's gone to all the doctors and she has spent all of her money and she is no better. In fact, she is only worse. And I can imagine over the course of a decade, think with me about this. I can imagine her awakening one morning and thinking, well, maybe today, this is a new doctor, maybe he has the answer. And she made her way to that doctor and he treated her, but she is not better. And the next day she awakens. Well, it's a new day, another doctor. Maybe he has the cure and he doesn't. And then a third doctor and a fourth doctor, and day after day and week after week and month after month and year after year, she has sought answers and she is only worse. Surely by this day, her day is one of despair and defeat and discouragement and depression. And surely she's wondering, why should this day be any different? Do you know anybody like that? Anybody who got up this morning? Maybe you got up this morning wondering, why should today be any different? Do you know anybody whose life just seems to be mess after mess after mess after mess, seeking in all kinds of wrong places for solutions, and it just keeps getting messier, and they woke up this morning with despair and discouragement? Do you know anybody like that? I would say to you what I said to the folks in the first service: if you don't know anybody like that, you do not know enough people. Because they're all over this city. They're all over this county. They're all over your state. They're all over my state. They're all over our nation. They are all over the world. People looking in all kinds of different directions for answers and finding none. For this woman on this desperate day, her day is about to change because, look at verse 27. There's a hint here. We're told why things are about to change. Having heard about Jesus. Somebody loved her enough to tell her something about Jesus. We don't know who it was. We don't know what she heard. Maybe somebody said, Jesus is coming through your town, and let me tell you what I've heard about him. He can give legs to the lame, and he can give sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf, and I've even heard he can raise the dead. So maybe he can do something for you. And she makes her way to Jesus and makes her way through the crowd and touches just the hem of his garment, according to another gospel writer. And instantaneously, Jesus did what no other doctor could do. He made her well in a moment. Jesus was the answer. Then we're introduced to another person. He's quite different than this woman. She is unnamed. He is named. He is Jairus. She's an outcast. He's a ruler of the synagogue. Her future was dim. We don't know much about his future, but we do learn this, that his daughter is dying. And again, I can step into the story and I can just see that daddy holding that baby daughter in his arms for the first time and looking into her little eyes and thanking God for that life. And I can see him pacing the floor back and forth when his daughter first became sick and he wanted her to get better. And I can envision the day when he recognized finally, even daddy can't fix her this time. She's dying. Surely he too went to all the doctors and spent all of his dollars, because that's what daddies do. Now he's come to the place to come running to Jesus, because apparently he heard something about Jesus too. And Jesus, for this desperate father and this dying daughter, he is the answer. Now here's my point, and I recognize this is basic, this is simple, this is fundamental, but we've got to lay this foundation. Here's the point. Jesus was the answer for these persons in these stories, and he is still the answer for us today. I don't know what you're facing in life. I don't know what you're up against. But you know what? You can read any book you want to read to try to find an answer. You can do every Google search you want to do. You can talk to anybody you want to talk to. But at the end of the day, no matter what you're facing in life, there is one answer. And that one answer still is and always will be Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We must come to him. You see, sometimes when life drops out beneath us, we don't run to God, we run from him. That's the wrong direction. We must come to Jesus. Here's number two. Here's point number two. We must trust that God is at work, even when we cannot see his hand. We must trust that God is at work, even when we cannot see his hand. Now again, go back to the story with me. I want you to see this crowd crushing up against Jesus, and this desperate daddy coming to him, please come touch my daughter. And Jesus agrees to go, and this crowd, this herd, begins making their way toward the home of Jairus. And surely Jairus is leading the way because it's his daughter who's dying, and he wants them to get there quickly, because as far as he knows, Jesus has to get there in time to heal his daughter. And so off they go, and then there is this woman who interrupts the whole thing. She touches Jesus' garment, and Jesus stops the parade. And he looks around and says, who touched me? And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But watch what he does. He draws her out, and he has a conversation with her. He talks to her. He heals her. He saves her. Meanwhile, the crowd is halted while he has this conversation. Now, tell me this. If you're Jairus and your daughter's dying and you want Jesus to get there in time, do you get a little antsy right now? I think so. Why? Because your daughter's dying, and Jesus said he would come. And now look at what Jesus is doing. He's stopping. He's talking to a woman. That was unusual in the first century, and she's an unclean woman. I can just hear Jairus saying to Jesus, would you get a move on? My daughter is dying. In fact, Jesus talks to this woman so long that word comes from the home of Jairus, your daughter is dead. And here's the response of the people. We don't need to bother Jesus anymore, because their faith in Jesus lasted only so long as if he got there in time to heal the daughter. And he didn't get there in time. He didn't do what he said he would do, at least from our perspective. Except watch what he does. Look at verse 36 of Mark 5. When Jesus overheard what was said, and the word overheard there can also mean ignored. He overheard it and he ignored it. He told the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, only what? Only believe. Now, why would Jesus say that? Here's what he says to Jairus. I know what you see. I know you see everything in front of you. Your daughter is dead. Everything you see says the most logical thing you can do is go home and bury your daughter and grieve with your wife. Except I'm saying to you, Jairus, you need to see more than you see. And what do we call that, by the way? The evidence of things unseen is what? It's faith. That you need to have faith. Now, why would Jesus say that? Because Jesus knows what Jairus cannot know. Jesus knows that God is still up to something here. It looks like Jesus didn't get there in time, but here's what Jesus knows. Though this story is now a tragedy, it's about to become miraculous. Though it now has an ending, it's about to have a new beginning. Though it's now a story of death, it's about to become a story of life. And Jesus knows this. Even though Jairus cannot know it, God is still working. And the responsibility for Jairus is just keep believing, even when you cannot see what God is doing. Let me tell you a way that I learned this. I have a younger brother in Ohio. He's 4 years younger than I adore my younger brother. I love him. But for years, he and I were going in two different directions. I was pastoring a church in Ohio, and he was getting messed up, strung out on drugs and alcohol, just desperately so. We prayed for him and prayed for him and prayed for him and prayed for him and prayed for him. Maybe you've been there. The more we prayed, the worse it seemed to get. And it just felt like God wasn't listening. My prayers weren't going past this ceiling. And I gave up on my little brother, and I came really close to giving up on God because God wasn't hearing my prayers. Well, on this particular Sunday, in the church where I was pastor, we had this little pew here for the pastor, and I was seated on this pew. And to my great surprise, in the door came my brother and my sister-in-law and my niece. They came all the way to the second row in our church, and nobody was sitting there. And so they took a seat, and I got ready to preach, and all the while I'm thinking, what in the world are they doing here? I preached, we extended a response time and invitation, and before we ever sang a word, they came out of that pew and came to me and said, we want to follow Jesus. You know what God did? God freed my little brother from drugs and alcohol almost overnight. God worked a miracle in his life. I got with him after the service, and I just told them, look, I'd given up on you. I was really close to giving up on God, so tell me how you got here. And they began to tell me stories of they would read a book that would direct them toward God, or they'd see something on the television that would make them think about this, or God would send people across their path to reintroduce them to their need to follow Christ. And all the while I was giving up, God was doing his work. Let me tell you what God taught me that day. And I should have known this by this point. Here's what God taught me. When God is doing his work, he is under no obligation to let us in on the details. Right or wrong? He is under no obligation to tell us what he's doing. And why is that? Here's the bottom line. Here's why that is. He's God and we're not. And the one who is God has a right to do whatever he wants to do, however he wishes to do it. And what's our job? Just keep trusting him. When I became a believer at age 13, my pastor said, you need to start praying for your parents who are not believers. When my younger brother turned back to Christ, he joined me in praying for my parents. So let me tell you the rest of the story. We prayed for my dad for 36 years. At age 71, my dad turned to Christ, and God radically changed him. We kept praying for my mom. We prayed for my mom for 47 years. Just a little over a year ago now, a year and a half ago now, my mom turned to Christ at age 79, and I had the privilege of baptizing her with my little brother in the water beside me. My younger brother, who's now a pastor in Ohio. God worked miracles. My mom lived just 6 months later. We had 6 months with her as my mom and my sister in Christ, and they were glorious. 47 years. I can't tell you how many times I was ready to give up, but here's what God says to us. Look, when life is hard, the bottom's dropped out, you wonder where God is, you come running to Jesus, and you believe that he's still up to something, even when you have no clue what it is. Trust him. Anyway, here's number 3. What do? We don't know what to do. We must believe that when God works, nothing gets in his way. I must believe that when God works, nothing gets in his way. Again, I want you to love the biblical text. I want you to see the story with me. In this story, there are two crowds that could get in the way. First of all, there's this crowd that's thronging around Jesus at the beginning of the story, and they make their way toward the home of Jairus. And here is this woman who is so desperate. In her culture, she should not have been talking to the rabbi. She certainly shouldn't have been touching his garment, but she is so desperate that she throws away all the social mores, and somehow she gets through the crowd, and she touches his garment, and Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" Not because he didn't know who it was, but because he was going to draw her out. Do you remember what the disciples said to him? They asked the logical question, "Master, look around you. Everybody's touching you. How can we tell you who touched you?" But here's the beauty of this text. You see, with all of these people pressing up against Jesus at this one moment, there is one woman who reaches out to him in faith, and he does not miss her touch. I love that because I think about my missionary friends around the world. I think about believers around the world. I think about this at this moment. There are all kinds of needs being lifted to the throne of God. People from nations all over the world praying. All kinds of different needs taken to the Father. Language after language after language being lifted, echoing around the heavens. All kinds of prayers at any given moment. But you know what? When you and I reach out to Jesus in faith, when we reach out, we cry out to him and touch just the hem of his garment. He hears our cry and he feels our touch as if we were the only ones crying out to him right then, because no crowd gets in our God's way. Well, then we go to the home of Jairus and there's another crowd there. You may know that in the first century, it was customary to hire professional mourners. There were people who made their living going from funeral to funeral to funeral crying. And the more important you were, the more mourners you would have. Well, remember, Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue. So he'd hired the mourners. They were there. When Jesus got there, they're earning their money. They are weeping and wailing. They are out of control. And Jesus says to them, "Why are you carrying on like this? This story is not over." Do you remember again what they did? They laughed at him. Which, by the way, isn't a very smart thing to do, to laugh at the Son of God. But watch what they do. See, one moment they're weeping and wailing, the next moment they're laughing. Look at how quickly they can turn their emotions on and off, because that's what they do for a living. They laugh at Jesus, and then the text next says that he put them all outside. The wording there for "put them all outside" is the same word in the original language for an exorcism. It's a casting out word. So more literally, the text says Jesus casts them out. He said to them, like he would say to a demon, "You get out of my way because I've got work to do," because nothing gets in our God's way. Do a quick Bible survey with me for a minute. Go with me to the Red Sea. The sea is right there in front of God's people. The Egyptian army is pursuing them. Was that a problem for God? No, God just rolled the waters back and led his people across on dry ground and collapsed the waters on the Egyptians. Go with me to the walled city of Jericho. It is so fortified that nobody's going in and nobody's coming out. Were those walls a problem for God? No, God said, "Here's the deal. You walk around like I tell you, blow your horns like I tell you, the walls will collapse," and down they came, because nothing gets in our God's way. Or go with me to a valley where there is a Philistine giant. Goliath is his name. He's taunting the armies of the living God, and nobody will fight him. Was that giant a problem for God? Oh, God raised up a shepherd boy. He gave him a rock and a sling and took that giant down, because no giant gets in our God's way. Or go with me to a lion's den where the prophet is. Daniel, is that a problem for God? Were the lions a problem for God? No, they weren't. He made them. So he just clamped their jaws shut because nothing gets in our God's way. Then go all the way forward with me to a borrowed tomb outside the walled city of Jerusalem, where the Son of God, crucified, now buried, dead, the demons surely rejoice. Was that a problem for God? No, it's central to our faith. God rolled the rock away to show us that his Son was alive and well, because even death doesn't get in the way of our God. Nothing gets in the way of our God. Now, why does that matter? Because you see, I don't know how high the hill is that you have to climb or will have to climb, or how deep the valley is that you have to walk through. I don't know how thick the walls are that you are pounding your head against. But this I do know, whatever you're up against, God is bigger. And we just have to believe that when God works, nothing gets in his way. Let's go to number 4. We must come to Jesus. We must trust that God is at work even when we cannot see his hand. We must believe that when God works, nothing gets in his way. Here's number 4. We must trust him to meet our needs. Now look with me at the end of the chapter. I want you to see how this story ends. Jesus raises this little girl. She's up. She's walking around. Verse 43 says that he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. The first part of this, they were in Jewish territory. The Jews misunderstood what their Messiah would be like. It wasn't the time yet for people to tell all of this. Jesus told them not to go tell. Another gospel writer tells us they went and told everybody anyway. Because how do you not when your daughter's dead and now she's alive? But then the story ends like this. He told them to give her something to eat. That's fascinating to me. Imagine the scene. This girl, now resurrected, walking around. Parents surely rejoicing. Maybe their hands are in the air praising God. Maybe their arms are wrapped around the legs of Jesus in gratitude. Maybe they're weeping great tears of joy. And in the midst of this partying, in the midst of this celebrating, Jesus says, feed the girl. And that's the way the story ends. What's he doing when he says feed her? I think there are two things that he wants to do. One, when he says feed her, he is saying to them, this really is your daughter in her physical body. This is not a figment of your imagination. It's not her ghost floating in the room. It's not that grief has so overwhelmed you that you're seeing things that aren't there. I really have resurrected her. And this really is she in her body, so much so that she needs nourishment. So feed her. He is validating the miracle when he says feed her. But I think there's another reason, a logical reason. Just think with me about it practically. If Jesus says feed her, what must he know about her? She must be what? Tell me. Hungry. Hungry. She's hungry. And Jesus knows that. He knows this little girl so intimately that he knows she's hungry. And the glory of that is this. This Jesus is the Jesus who is the master over nature. He speaks and the wind ceases. This Jesus is the master over demons. He speaks and they flee. This is Jesus who is the master over sickness. In the very hem of his garment there is healing. This Jesus is the master over death. We just saw that. This Jesus has made everything that ever has been made. This Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, before whom every single one of us will ultimately bow. And this same Jesus knows you, he knows me, he knows this little girl so intimately that he knows when our belly rumbles because we're hungry. And that's a sweet, sweet God. He knows when our belly rumbles. Like mine is right now, actually. That's how well he knows us. And you know what? When he knows us that well, we can trust him to meet our needs, can't we? Now, will he meet them exactly like we think he should? Not necessarily, but he's God and we're not. Is he going to work according to our time, our calendar, our clock? Maybe not, but he's God and we're not. but we can trust him to meet our needs. Now here's the point. Let's wrap it up. How do you trust God when you don't know what to do? You do know what to do. Come running to Jesus. Believe that God's at work even when you cannot see his hand. Know that when God works, nothing gets in his way.